This is a very, very significant debate. This is a debate about the budget of our country, the fiscal future of our country. It's a debate that is probably the biggest fiscal debate we've had in this country in decades. It's 9 o'clock on a Wednesday night. This is a debate that's going to go on for 3 hours into the late part of the night. I wonder why the majority decided, let's have this debate when everybody's watching CSI. Let's have this debate when no one's watching C-SPAN. If we're so excited about this budget, why aren't we having this debate in the broad daylight? If we really think this is the way forward for America, why don't we talk about it when America's watching? It's almost like a pay raise debate. Now, let's talk about this budget. We need more than just 3 hours, I would say, to debate this budget. Let's look at just what this budget does. Now, you're going to hear 3 words or 3 phrases. Spends too much, borrows too much, taxes too much. That underscores what this budget really does. Madam Chairman, the debt held by the public under this budget doubles in 5.5 years, triples in a little over 10 years. Let's put it a different way. The kind of red ink this budget proposes for our children and our grandchildren, for our country, is more under this presidency than the presidencies of George Washington to George W. Bush combined. We used to see these charts out in front of the offices of the members who call themselves Blue Dogs until charts were banned out in front of offices that said, here's what the national debt is, here's your share, it's shameful, it's terrible, we've got to get our debt under control. And yet we're being told that the Blue Dogs are marching in lockstep for this budget that doubles the national debt in 5.5 years and triples it in 10.5 years. And one thing would be interesting, one thing would be a decent argument, if all the tax increases in this budget, $1.5 trillion in tax increases. The biggest tax increase we last had was $345 billion. $1.5 trillion in tax increases. Small businesses, the assets that make up our pension funds, our 401k funds, our college savings plans, energy. One estimate from MIT says the cap-and-trade scheme could raise taxes on households by as much as $4,500 a year. Congressional Budget Office says, no, it's more like $1,600 a year. Point is, a lot of taxes. Are these tax increases being used to reduce the deficit? Are these tax increases being used to pay down debt, like President Clinton proposed in 1993, the last time we had a really large tax increase? No. They're to fuel higher spending. But what's worse than all of that, from a fiscal recklessness standpoint, is all these new taxes, $1.5 trillion, is to finance even more spending. So we're putting our country on this vicious cycle of chasing ever higher spending with ever higher taxes that never quite catch up with that spending to give us a record amount of debt. The problem is, one day, maybe people won't buy our debt. What happens when that happens? So we're going to hear from our colleagues over the next hour and 45 minutes about all the great investments in education, the great investments in this and the investments in that, and spending money on this and spending money on that, and just how great and compassionate that is. I want to tell you one thing. I want to show you what the Congressional Budget Office just told us. And here's what they told us. My 3 children, who are 4, 5, and 7 years old, when they are my age, here's the tax bill that will be due them. This is the Congressional Budget Office, if we don't get this under control. This is the tax rates that will be necessary to tax the next generation. When my kids are my age, raising their kids in Janesville, Wisconsin, just like I'm doing with my wife and myself, the bottom tax bracket for that generation, if we pass this budget and pass this bill onto them, 10% bracket goes up to 26%. Middle-income taxpayers, who now pay a 25% income tax bracket, pay 66% The upper bracket, which is the one that the small businesses pay, instead of paying 38%, or it's about to be 40, will pay 92%. This is not some mythical pie-in-the-sky estimate. This is the Congressional Budget Office saying, if you're going to raise taxes to pay for all this borrowing, then here's what the next generation is going to get. We are passing on to the next generation the most reckless budget, the most reckless deficit and borrowing spree in generations. Here is my biggest concern, and I want to yield to some of my colleagues here. My concern is that at the beginning of this budget debate, what we really ought to be talking about here is, do we want the America we know and love, or do we want to take that system, put it aside, and adopt another form of government, adopt a European-style system? Because that is, after all, what we're talking about here. Do we want to have our tax levels, our debt levels, the size of our government levels, at these huge levels that we know history's stories very well, that show us high unemployment, stagnant wages, lower standards of living? I just find it so interesting and so ironic that European capitals are lecturing us today on fiscal discipline. It's kind of embarrassing, actually. I find it amazing that the Chinese are lecturing us about getting our borrowing under control because they're worried about the value of our currency and our bonds. It's embarrassing. And yet, in the middle of the night, we bring this budget up that proposes this enormous gusher of more spending, more borrowing, more taxing. And we think this is the road to prosperity? This is the road to serfdom. We will offer an alternative tomorrow. Yes, our friends on the left will disagree with that alternative. We want America back. We want the country we grew up in. We want the country that says we're going to have a safety net to help those people who cannot help themselves, help them when they're down on their luck. We don't want everybody laying in a hammock where they're dependent on the government. We want a country that rewards achievement, production, activity, working hard, improving your life, making your life better for you, and making sure in your generation you take on your responsibilities, fix the problems so your kids are better off. That's the America we grew up in. That's the America we want. And that's the America you're kissing away with this budget. We're going to talk numbers. We're going to talk statistics. But at the end of the day, we are passing an unconscionable amount of debt onto the next generation, and it's going to kill our current economy. I'm not one who is typically that passionate. I'm not one who typically comes down here and says things like this, but I have never seen a budget like this in my life. I have never seen the numbers quite this awesome and how big they are. This is a budget that should be rejected. We want bipartisanship, but for the majority to have it, you got to collaborate with us. And we're asking the Blue Dogs, I know you're out there. I know you're thinking about this vote. I know you're listening. Help us. Do you want your fingerprints on this mountain of borrowing? Do you want to go home to your constituents who you told you were going to be fiscal conservatives and say you signed up for this stuff? You have the votes to stop this. The people who call themselves Blue Dog Democrats can stop this bill. They have the votes to do that. Do it. And join us. And then let's work together to fix this. I want to close my comments the way I opened them in the markup. The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Spratt, is a true gentleman. He brings real definition to this Northerner as to what it means to be a Southern gentleman. I would love nothing more than to sit across the table from that man and strike a real budget bargain that actually reduces our debt, that actually puts our fiscal house in order, because that's the kind of man that could do that kind of a budget. He did it in 1997. I think he can do it again. Unfortunately, this administration, this House leadership, is leading us off the leftward lift. They're leading us off a leftward cliff. And it is in the power of those Democrats who call themselves Blue Dogs to stop it from happening. And I am begging you, please, stop this crime on the next generation.